these wonderful presentations. They work so well together. But as Arlette knows, I am a student of language as well. And as you know, Orwell hated the IZE suffix, IZE formations, euthanization, funeralization, whatever it might be, that debase our language. Radicalization, to put that IZE, just to break the word down a little bit more, radicalism or radical. But IZE, which is very common in our time, you invent a kind of grammatical error that actually speaks of process. Anything with IZE on the end immediately gives a sense of process rather than a fixity or a finality to it. And so it makes you wonder where the process started, where it's going, where it might be. My impression politically with Orwell is that the US government, the Canadian government, other governments would like radicalization to signify something that can never ever be reversed or cured.
Yes.
And that they are winning these kinds of propaganda wars, which is what Orwell's basically writing about propaganda. So that the idea of incurability, even if you became benign or moderate, you would just be a sleeper, as they say. A latent sleeper, invisible, hiding in plain sight. Would you have any comments on this notion of that incurability and irreversibility?
Yes. I think that's exactly it. And as we trace...
Which is what they say about Omar.
That's right. Well, that's
there's
right.
There's no going back.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think you're right. And so, language does shift and change. That's part of it. And it may be that there'll be another entry in the OED that signals that radical now means or radicalized, infected incurably with a propensity for violence. I think that's exactly
that seems to me, Orwell went on to write about a perpetual state of war in 1984. It seems to me governments may want, may need, or take advantage of some notion of endless war.
Right.
Others of you who want to comment on that question?
It's interesting to put it that way too, right? Because you do see radicalize something, there has to be an end to the process, right? And just as you were both talking, you just reminded me when you see law enforcement specifically, we need to have anti-radicalization strategies. But what does that actually mean, and what are you trying to be anti for, right? Because if we look at the discussions we had here, using that model we talked about here, most of us have some kind of grievance and ideology that could be or couldn't be determined as radicalized. So how are you trying to counter something that's hard to define and think constantly shifts? And I think that's where the focus is too much on that radicalized aspect, that it misses that point of what it's really leading to that is the concern. That's violent extremism or violence or terrorism or whatever we're trying to look at. And I think that process that you kind of identified is the thing that needs to be refocused, right? Because I think we focus too much on this radicalization word that it becomes meaningless almost.
Yes, exactly. Which is what Orwell would say, meaninglessness.
Yeah. Steve, did you have a comment on that before?
Yeah, but I'll hold off, Richard. A few years ago, the student group I advised, the Lutheran Student Movement, had as its topic radical hospitality. Ooh, what a conjunction of words, eh? I guess the reason I thought of this is because that's it's a great word. It's who wouldn't want to be radically hospitable? So what I'm asking though is, I feel kind of helpless with, I know I'm not helpless, but our federal government continues to use these terms that are inciting fear, that are mislabeling. Like this fellow that shot up the parliament, the wife of the fellow who was killed said he was mentally ill, and we need to address that by putting more money in mental health programs. And she's the one that is closest to the individual who was killed, and she's saying that. So, but there's this. It seems there's something to be made or built by the government on the fact that he was a terrorist. But anyway, long story short, I guess the question I have is, I too and especially, I mean, you've really helped me to kind of coalesce this, feel that something's being co-opted. And yeah, it's this word radical that's been co-opted to advance some other agenda. So my question is, how do we take it back? You know, you take it back, and I think of who's the guy who wrote D.H. Lawrence, Lady Chatterley's Lover. Like, he tried to use the F word everywhere because he felt that, you know, there was something good about that word, and he wanted to take it back, you know. So he litters his book with this word. Of course, you know, it didn't succeed, and it's still a swear word. But anyway, I'm just wondering how we can take back the word radical, and generate beyond this discussion, like, you know, a kind of movement to say, hey, wait a minute, you just tainted a really, you know, like a sacred kind of word. Yeah.
Is that for everyone?
Yeah, that's for everybody. Yeah. Everybody here.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible to take it back. I mean, I hate what's been done to it, but you know, it may now be. It's like the word. It's like a word like terrorist. You know, maybe what we need to do is try and expand language and find a different word to convey the same thing. But I hate to just sort of, you know, allow perfectly good words to be politicized. Sorry, the IZE. To the point where they really die as a conveyor of meaning or a shaper of meaning. You know?
Yeah.
So what other words might we use besides the word radical or radicalization to talk about the positive ways that that deep particular religious traditions form people, yeah.
Sometimes I think we can redeem it,
Mm-hmm.
you know? I mean, you simply use it in positive ways.
Mm-hmm.
You use it intentionally in life-giving ways, and that, you know, I mean, the word gay, for example, started off meaning one thing, became a word of derision, and now has been reclaimed.
Queer. But wasn't radical a positive? Didn't teenagers? Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah.
Skaters
Yeah.
did.
You know, when I was in campus ministry back at Dow, this was like in the early 2000s. There was a group called the Radical Cheerleaders. They called themselves the Hallirads, right? And you know, they were all sort of black and red mixture of Marxist anarchist, right? But I don't know if they would use that term now. It's just, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's like a word like religion, you know. I mean, nobody wants to self-identify as religious. You know, they want to self-identify as spiritual. You know. Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak a bit to the climate of hate, because it seems there, you know, if we were trying to draw another schematic, it seems that the energy and language around radicalization could connect back to your rain cloud. There seems some intensity or some actual political desire, it seems to me, to create that climate of hate. So I wondered if you could just speak to that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know, like, just in some of the work that I do and I've done in the past, they are intentional in terms of the way that they are being connected to a form of a perspective that is being fueled by hate, right? And for me, the hate portion is what really fuels that violence, extremism, and the violence part of that extremism, right? Because even if you do have a grievance that's fueled by some kind of ideology, most of us will try to manage it in various ways, right? But the second it's clouded under a climate of hate, that's where it reaches that violent aspect, right? So when you see different forms of hate crime that happen in the city, for example, it's often done through those that have such a one-sided, narrow-minded view about a certain group whether it be by race, gender, religion, ethnicity, whatever that might be. And I think it really fuels a lot of the ways that we try to understand some of those aspects of hate, but at the same time try to tie it back to countering that resistance, right? I think to me that's the biggest thing we have to do is under these tense times, as a community, that's where we need to come together even stronger, right? Because when you do have that, when you have that connection to some who are creating momentum to, give hate, I guess you could say for lack of a better word, we need to come closer together, right? That's why for me it was very powerful to see that, the first couple of weeks when I was hearing about this group in Germany, I was just shocked because again, the analogy I use, I can't imagine walking down Churchill Square and seeing 20,000+ people protesting against a certain group, a certain religion, let's say, right? And then to see that happen in a democratic society there, and then see a counter resistance happen as well. I think to me that's where we need to really strengthen ourselves and community specifically to make sure that climate of hate, is one small segment that we, as you said, go over top of and say, this is actually what we want and how we want to treat other people.
But I think what we have to be careful of is to not hate the haters.
Yes.
And that's what ends up happening.
Yeah.
There's the climate of, and that's...
It's really interesting. So just yesterday or the day before, again, just because it's so hot in Germany right now because of what's happening, so there was another protest group that had brought about 10,000 supporters that were marching towards, the anti-Islamicization of Germany. And the bigger major cities now, like so Dresden specifically, they aren't accommodating these marches anymore, so they have to go to smaller urban centers. And so just the other day, going back to not hating the haters, but countering that hate in a more positive angle, they were at this anti-Islamic protest, and people within the crowd themselves started handing out these flyers. And on the flyers was a website that seemed on the surface to support that anti-Islamic point of view, but when people went back and logged onto the website, it was actually counter that. It was people getting information about what you guys are protesting right now. Not only is it extremely hateful, but your stats and your fears are being fueled by ignorance, right?
Yes.
So it's getting creative in trying to counter that narrative, but not, like you said, hating on the haters, right? Because then that doesn't much, what's that saying, an eye for an eye keeps the whole world blind, right? And I think that's something we definitely don't want to promote at all.
Something that's really a part of this is fear.
Yes.
And maybe I want to talk about the fearification. Too many English profs here. Fearizing. How is it that people? I'm reading John Cleese's autobiography, which is great. And he talks about his mother, who every time he went to see her, she would have like a long list of things that she was afraid of, and it would like last the whole day. And he makes this little comment where he says, my mother's worldview, she saw the cosmos as one giant booby trap. And I think that's emerging with, people are very afraid.
It is.
And in a climate of fear, hatred becomes a sort of a reflex, right? So not only talking about how do we deal with or combat hatred, but also how do we combat fear.
That's right. And to bring that around, right? The scriptural injunction, perfect love casts out fear. And so that notion then, where else except in a radical pursuit of one's faith practice does it become possible to love the enemy, right? To cut against that intention to, you say, I think we're enjoined to speak truth and to be thoughtful and to point things out, but to not hate those who do things that we object to.
Hate the action, not the person.
That's right. Yeah, and to seek wherever possible common purpose, and maybe even to understand that this tension that religions particularly include both a generative component and a destructive component. And sometimes it's the more destructive component that's the most interesting and life-giving. The way that Jesus, for example, came to break down some of the societal practices and codes that had become stultifying, death-dealing. Yeah, so you know that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Others, anyone else?
Well, if no one else. The other thing I found thought-provoking was when you were discussing religion being actually your life. I mean, it's a way of life. It's not it's not put in a it's not just Saturday synagogue or Sunday church or Friday prayer. It's your life. And I think what people I have listened to, the fear I hear about Islam is that they feel that it's not enough for Muslims to make that their lives. They're afraid that they want to make it everyone's life. And that goes back to when Sharia law was trying to be put in, I think in Quebec. Ontario. Okay. And I know I come from I'm a Jew. And in Judaism, we have very specific laws about marriage and divorce. That if you are an observant Jew, that's the way you marry and that's the way you divorce. But we also have to have a civil document to live in the country in which we live in. And if we can't get the religious document, that just affects us within our religion. It doesn't affect us within the world. And I think that's a fear that I've heard expressed a lot about a Muslim, the Muslim takeover of the world, which there used to be the Jewish takeover of the world, so now you guys are taking the heat off of us. It's very nice to have the heat removed. It's crazy because and I think the 5% was interesting too, because I think 5% is the percentage at which when Jews became 5% or more of the population in any country, all of a sudden anti-Semitism started.
So
And not before that.
Almost like that's the threshold.
It's a tipping, it's like, they're here. There's enough of them that, So it's all very scary.
And I think it's interesting though, because I mean, some of the stuff that as you're speaking, I mean, this is just like a regurgitation of stuff that's happened in the past, but now you're just replacing group X with group Y, right? And then group Z, 10, 15 years from now, the exact same discussion is going to happen, right? So, I mean, it's really interesting from my perspective to just kind of see these same discussions and same cycles that seem to be occurring based on that cycle of fear as well, I think, right?
Absolutely. Fear of the unknown.
Probably have time for one more, so if someone else who hasn't had to have a chance to say something, otherwise Richard.
We'll let Richard have it.
I waited.
Well, I guess my question, I'm a member of the Interfaith Chaplains Association, and we've had a number of interfaith dialogues over the years. I remember one interfaith dialogue, it was about how religions can bring people together. And the Muslim student who was representing Islam on the panel, he said, yes, of course, religions can bring people together. And his sort of solution to this was that, when we all become Muslim, we'll all be together. Now, and was entertaining the idea of Canada becoming a theocracy. And, I was kind of like, whoa, did I just hear that? And of course I heard that, because of course there are people who feel that their religion is really it. And that the solution to all the problems in the world is that everyone should become a convert to that religion. So, perhaps fundamentalists of every stripe and every religion could be, could be given that sort of, or asking for that in some way, or demanding that. So
we need
I mean, to me,
we
there's
have radical capitalism.
So what's that?
We have radical capitalism. We just don't call it that.
Well, that's
and that
true.
is the religion that
You're
most
here.
countries
Yeah.
adhere to.
Or what is it called?
And-
Disaster capitalism.
And we try to export it, and we try to inflict it.
Inflicted, yeah.
So if fundamentalism is something that's it just covers everything, and that capitalism becomes like almost like a cult. That seems to be the root of a lot of ills, and it's not religious. It's like, I'm glad you introduced capitalism, because it's kind of a hunkering down that just doesn't give room for anything else. And when I hear that from fundamentalist Christians, it drives me crazy. And I want to say, well, that's not Christianity. Well, and then somebody else will say, well, that's their version of Christianity. Oh gosh, yeah, okay. It's the eye for eye Christianity. So anyway, I just wonder, and maybe you could reflect a bit on what do we do about fundamentalism?
And I think you raise an interesting question, because I see this is kind of the confliction that we sometimes have with connecting, let's say, regardless of what faith it might be, connecting that form of, I think you framed it well when you said, every person, regardless of their faith, if they're strongly believing in it, they want you to join as well, right? Like, hey, come on, everything's all good on this side, it's better than your side, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then that's where we get that fear, going back to your point of, well, now all of a sudden this person who is trying to convert me to something I'm not sure of, are they radical? Right? So it goes back to how we might conflate some different forms of fundamentalism and now conflating with radicalization. Right? I think you mentioned it earlier in your portion of your talk, where when you mentioned, expressing some forms of your faith in a moderate way is deemed appropriate, but the second is viewed in a space that might seem not moderate to others based on whatever threshold we might be using. That's when all of a sudden the faith becomes a risk, right? And then looking at it from, let's say, a law enforcement perspective, which I do a lot of work with, that to me is where the concern lies, right? Because all of a sudden it turns into someone who is getting ready for prayer during a time that, let's say, congregational prayer is not there, but that act all of a sudden being deemed as a fundamental act and maybe a sign of radicalization, right? So it's that confliction of certain adherence to certain aspects of faith, and then saying that is going to be a byproduct of leading someone down a radical path, which is further going to lead someone down a path of violent extremism, right? And I think that's where collectively we need to, going back, I can't remember who was talking about, but we need to kind of reclaim that word back for radical and try to understand that it isn't just a slippery slope where all of a sudden someone who appears to be fundamentalist is now all of a sudden radical, and now all of a sudden we have a violent extremist on our hand. Police are going to come to your house, kick the door down, okay, we've solved terrorism. That's not the case at all, right? This is very loaded language and very loaded terms that we here today are at least trying to grapple with it, which I think it's fantastic, but that's just us in a small room. Because the second we leave, the same narratives we hear misguiding some are going to be out there as well, right? And I don't want to pick on my wife here, but she told me a story about a coworker she had that's concerned about this radicalization problem, right? And writing letters to government. And that's the side we don't see as well, because they have an obligation to act, and how they act maybe isn't the best way sometimes, but they're getting that side of the coin as well, right? So really trying to frame it in a space that helps us understand the situation. And I know I'll end here, and I'll open up to if you guys want to comment. But I think just the fact that this is the second round in Canada anyways where this radicalization discussion has come up in the last like 10 years, this is the first time that we're finally having open discussion about it. And to me, that's very promising because the first batch, let's say in 2006 when it happened, there was no discussion. There was just that connection of alienated, radicalized Muslim youth are becoming terrorists, right? That was the equation that was being used at that time. Whereas the second time around, there's more discussion, there's more dialogue, and there's more of a willingness and commitment from both community and government to work together, right? And I think that's something we didn't see the first time around, and from my perspective, is something that's very, very positive to see. Whether government takes those suggestions or truly works together is yet to be seen, but at least to some extent, the table and the chairs there at the table.
Can I get a very fast footnote?
Very fast, sure.
The first time fundamentalism appears in English language would probably surprise people. It's 1910, a small group of Presbyterians in New York State were alarmed by brothels and alcohol.
Oh.
And they set out a list of religious fundamentals. And that was the first time fundamentalism appeared.
Yeah, it's really misapplied, isn't it?
Well, it's a nonsense word. It's like,
Yeah.
it becomes meaningless as a word. Thank you.
Fundamentalization.
Fundamentalization.
All right, well, I think we're going to have to bring our time to a close tonight. So join me in thanking our panelists, especially